Hey everybody, and welcome back to our scenario playthrough series. This is number 25, Barony Bridge. We've got to get 1,200 guests by the end of October Year 3 with a park rating of at least 600. This is quite possibly one of the worst scenarios in the game. So we had Big Pier last go around when we were in the original game, and I didn't like that one for similar reasons, because there's really nothing solid to build on. You're just going over top of water, and since we're not using the RCT2 scenery or raising scenery, we don't really have the ability to do any of that kind of stuff. So you're really just kind of building without a lot of the typical features of the game. Now, Big Pier has the saving grace of it's a pier, so it kind of makes sense from a theming standpoint and makes at least a little bit more sense than this one, which is an abandoned bridge that's now getting turned into a theme park. So I don't really love this. There's also these two little mounds of sand, I guess, on either side of the bridge that we do own the land for. So theoretically we can do something small with those, although we really don't in this, just because it didn't quite make sense to me to do anything there. So if we're being honest, this one is kind of one of those throwaway scenarios where we just need to get through it so we can continue on to the more interesting ones. So you'll see both of these videos, part 1 and part 2, are on the shorter end, and I wouldn't necessarily say that what we're going to do here is any kind of groundbreaking stuff or any of that. So we're going to make an effort for some decent rides and coasters and stuff, but in the end, this one is a just kind of a check the box situation and move along. So we started out here with a carousel and a swing ship. I've been very cognizant of trying to keep everything as condensed and solidified as I can. I want this to feel like effectively a pier, so one kind of giant section of construction, I guess, that rides and shops and stuff are placed on top of. Of course, we can't really do that in RCT, but we can fake it, so that's what we're doing here with having the paths kind of surround the rides just right up to their boundaries, and having the queues and everything kind of fill in all that gap space, and then also trying to build a lot of the shops and stalls to kind of fill in that empty space as well. So we'll do as best as we can to make it feel kind of dense. But it's time for the first coaster. So we're going to do a wooden coaster, since we couldn't do that one in Big Pier. And what I want to do is kind of an out and back wooden coaster here that's probably going to turn into a double out and back one. So initially we're going to start with an L-shaped layout here, with starting kind of in the corner. Since we have effectively a big square worth of land to work with, I wanted to kind of build right up to the edges just in case we needed it. We won't actually need all of it. We won't need anywhere close to all of it, but I wanted to at least make sure that I've got the amount of space to work with. So I'm going to build effectively right up to the corner. Stop to pause and build a scrambler there just to continue to get us some attendance and everything. But you can see I'm starting in the middle there with the corner, that right-hand corner, which is situated up in the corner of the land area that we have to work with. And as I've continued to build a little bit, I noticed that I wanted to adjust kind of the spacing of things a little bit. And we'll see this a couple times where I've basically needed to rebuild the setup and just shift it over ever so slightly. It's one of those things where it would always be nice if there was a way to do that more easily than either completing the track and saving it, or just rebuilding it from scratch. But alas, at the moment we don't have that. So we're going to continue onto this kind of a layout here with a decent sized drop right into a turnaround, crossover, go to the other side, and then do a second turnaround. And now I want to go back around one more time. So I'm doing this sort of double up element here, so it has a little less speed once we get to that turnaround. We can always go just one or two steep pieces, but unfortunately what you're really trying to balance here is going from multiple steep pieces to a single steep piece to less than one of those as your overall height, because the gradation transitions between each of those elements steps down either way too much or not quite enough. So that's why we use these kind of double up elements and everything to give it some more space, and that's where the wooden coaster works really well, because that kind of an element is fairly acceptable here. So you can see this instance where I am having to move the whole darn thing over by just a single one. So I'm going to turn on clearances, or turn off clearances here for just a second, so it can make this easier for me to build across and work with this. I'm not doing banking on any of these elements here just because, for the most part, they are high up. I mean, these types of coasters, anyway, the whole idea for it is that they have slower turnarounds and faster hill sections. This is a fairly traditional type of coaster design, so this one could be maybe in the 50s or something like that, for example. Could be more modern too, but for the most part, we're just going to not do the banking because that's going to look a little more realistic in the end. I'm also going to circle outside of that first turnaround. You can do it either stacked or you can do it outside. Typically, and more traditionally, it would be stacked, so directly underneath of that turnaround. The one thing with RCT is that it's a lot easier to line up to go around the outside of it, and it also nests very nicely. And since we're not building any scenery, you don't have a weird gap where the supports are just visually missing. So now it's a matter of trying to complete our layouts. We have this station going in the same direction as our return run here, but to just bring it right back into the brakes at this point would be kind of short because we basically made one loop and then wrapped back around again. We kind of want to go for that whole double out and back look. So what we can see here is I've decided to, instead of running the station in the original direction, we're going to turn it around and add a little pre-lift section in here. For these more, older coasters, you would typically see that pre-lift in a tunnel or something of that nature. You think of Phoenix at Knoebels, for example. But since we aren't using scenery we can raise, we're just going to pretend, I guess. But this lets us complete our double out and back layout, also do a little bit of a pre-lift section, and make a fairly decent sized layout that bounds this side of the park fairly well, I think. We'll go down to the 2 trains because we don't have any additional space there. And I'm also going to do the whitewashed wood look on this. I get a lot of questions on the stream about why we don't see more white wooden coasters these days. And part of that is just from an inspection standpoint. So you want to be able to inspect a wooden coaster for rot or other imperfections or things like that. If you paint it, you cover over those things. So it's a little bit harder to see the issues that are going on. Now, conversely, with a lot of seaside parks, the paint helped to further protect the wood over time. So that's why you see a lot of older seaside parks having that whitewash wood, and why that would be kept up, because that way it's going to really fight off some of that salt corrosion and other things that you get with a seaside environment. So that's your little coaster tech quick minute there. Now we're going to continue on and fill in some more tracked rides here. Part of the trouble with the tracked rides is that, unlike a typical pier, for example, where this car ride might sit on top of some kind of a wood decking or wood platform, we don't have that because we don't have the scenery options to do it. So this guy's just going to be up on stilts, kind of floating around the water here. So in the end, I'm trying to make it sort of as dense as possible, and I'm going to build in the queue ahead of time just to help complete that density. And really, I'm just kind of winding this car ride around. It's doing a couple little hills here and there. Just it feels like there's not really a whole lot of stuff we can build off of, because usually I'm going to use the landscape or other things like that to work on a better layout that better serves kind of the surrounding areas. But in this instance, we really don't have any of those surrounding areas, so we're just going to build a sort of windy, compact layout, which works in the end. We're going to use the Cheshire Cat cars in response to a request from someone watching on Twitch, and we'll do some random colors for that, which I always like having different colors for the car ride. I don't usually do it because I'm kind of lazy, I guess, but I just kind of like that overall look. And by the way, if you want to join us on any of these streams that I do live for all of these scenario builds, you can join us on twitch.tv/Amusement Academy. Typically, I'm going live on Fridays at around 6 p.m. GMT, I suppose. But it varies a little bit. If you join our Discord, which you can get the link below, you can get all of our updates on streaming times and stuff like that. So now we're going to fit into this little section next to the wooden coaster a double tower ride, and I'm going to do one shot and one drop, just because that seems like a good mix here. I'm also going to do a non-white version of the tower. Usually white's sort of my go-to because it's typically a standard for S&S Towers, but not required by any means. S&S do plenty of these with colored towers as well, and makes it stand out, makes it a little bit brighter. Since we don't have theming or landscaping or anything else, we need some color to give this whole area a little bit of something interesting, I suppose. So that's going to get a good attendance draw in here. And this one, like I said, is a shorter video because without theming or landscape to consider, when we really can't do anything, I guess, super special or unique with all of this, we're going to really just spend time building stuff and making it as compact as we can make it. So in the end, we're going to hit the goal pretty early on and then kind of have to sit around waiting for the timeline to end. This is one of those where we don't need some advertisements as far as I recall, and it's a pretty easy one to get there. I'm going to throw in the 3D cinema as well. As I've said many a time before, it's not really my favorite ride, but at the same time, in this instance, it kind of fits because it's just sort of an eclectic architecture and just mix of attractions that kind of sit here. I'm going to do another coaster here. This is going to be a Steel Wild Mouse. So if you remember, the Steel Wild Mouse was one that we unlocked with the Corkscrew Follies scenarios, and we built a couple of them so far, I believe. Canary Mines, just last go around, had one as well. What I want to do for this one, if you recall, Canary Mines was more of a Mack Rides Wild Mouse. This one is intended to be more of an L&T Systems, which is a little less known ride manufacturer, but they do some pretty interesting wild mice rides that are surprisingly brutal in some instances, pretty intense different coasters. And they kind of do a situation where the top section has your traditional slaloms that go back and forth, kind of aligned with the lift as you're seeing so far here. And then the second half does slaloms in the other direction, interspersed with some hills. So what I want to do here is make sure that I've got enough space underneath of the switchbacks up above to get our back and forth with some of those hills underneath, and then really kind of make this whole thing fit. And you can see trying a couple of different options here for the switchback elements. So one of the things that I always kind of have a gripe at with RCT is just the grid system is sometimes a little bit too small and at the same time a little bit too big to do some interesting or more realistic elements for different rides. And one of those is the Wild Mouse, and part of that is really these switchbacks probably ought to be 3 tiles, so one kind of out, and then you have a turnaround that's 180 degrees that takes up 3 tiles instead of 1, or instead of 4, I guess, if you did the full 2x2 there. It's sort of in the middle, and unfortunately we don't really have some turns that do that. We can always put a straight piece in between, but it just doesn't look quite so good. So in the end, we're going to kind of make the best of it here and kind of find a middle ground. And I swapped out the lift for a steep lift, the shallower lift, I mean, and that gives us some space to work with down here and kind of go back and forth. It's not quite as realistic as I might want it to be, but it works well enough, I guess, and goes here. We're going to do the entrance and the exit station, do a lot of these block breaks and everything, so then we can run a bunch of different trains on here. Obviously, it's fairly easy if you just do continuous circuit mode, because that is just easy to pile a bunch of trains on there. But obviously, whenever we can do it, we're going to use our block breaks just because it's more realistic. So I'm going to go ahead and save this one so that I can rebuild it in a different spot. And looked over there initially, but then in the end I settled for over on this side, kind of right adjacent to the wooden coaster, so that way we have our space filled in as compactly as we can. And we'll get that one opened up to the guests, so then we can bring folks in. Now we've unlocked a swinging inverter ship, and we're going to double up on this one too, just because we can at this point. You know, we typically are doing this in a lot of scenarios because it's good for the attendance draw and works to get all those guests through the door to get our goals. In this instance, we're going to do the back-to-back in this kind of square on the end here and fill in some gaps to remove some of this pathway and move it around just a little bit. We lost our guest here, Danny G, I think was the name, although we picked it up on Twitch as Danny P. So we memorialized them here a little bit later with some flowers on one of the islands, and we'll definitely send a gift basket to that family, but we'll remain with Danny P in our thoughts, I suppose. So now we have our swinging inverter ships. I'm going to go ahead and paint these. I never figure out what to paint these things. It's just, they always seem sort of like you want something more dark and menacing, but this instance we're going with a bunch of gray and silver, I guess, with a yellow and a pink arm on the thing. So, why not something different? Might as well. There's our ride that was renamed in memory of Danny P because he died in our attempt to build this coaster, or flat ride, so we will keep him in our thoughts. We've unlocked the Roto Drop, and that seems like the next thing to build, but before we do that, I wanted to do another coaster, and it makes sense to go ahead and do a bobsled, because those are decent little rides. They're also associated with our pier building, I suppose, just as we go back to something like Bumbly Beach, where we had the Blackpool inspired scenario, and the Mack Bobsled that's at that park as well. So we're going to do those in just a second. First, I wanted to throw in this little boat hire here at the end, and do a little seating area here as well. We'll go ahead and do canoes just because we can. I don't really have any kind of rhyme or reason on which one of those I use. So we'll pick canoes this time. Fill in some of these gaps with some of these shops and stalls and things. And I would put a larger variety of shops and stalls, but we really don't want to spend time researching those at this point. Not that we're really in trouble from a research standpoint. We've got plenty of rides to work with, but I really want to focus on the things that are more important before we get into the shops and stalls. So we'll do those at the end, but for now, we're going to use what we've got and just place a whole bunch of them. Now we've got our bobsled going in, and what I've done, similar to the Wild Mouse, is I've just kind of picked a space over here on this side of the bridge, and we're just going to build it, save it, and then move it where we want to. So this gives us some flexibility, especially when we know that we're not interacting with landscaping, so we can really just use the open space to build it however we want to do it. And this one has that sort of Blackpool-inspired ride design where we're going to have just a bunch of left-right slaloms, work our way down, and then we can get ourselves to a finished product. So here we are with our finished layout, and just trying to test out a couple things. The brake runs are a little bit small. Again, you struggle on the bobsleds here in game just because we don't have diagonals. It's just kind of a pain, unfortunately, but we're going to deal with what we've got. It's unfortunately one of the more limited ride types in the game, but we can make the best of it. So trying to make this whole thing work and see where we can place this in our space. I wanted to maybe do some kind of a bit of a cross over the bridge here, so seeing that the first section is kind of higher up than the last and sort of this one continued gradient down can make that work fairly well, and we'll stick it here over top of the bridge a little bit. It gives us a little bit of interaction here and there. Initially, my thought was maybe this bridge kind of goes away entirely. We can remove some sections of it, which we will do here a little bit later. And I was trying to think of a way to incorporate this in some kind of a bit of a clever way, but I really couldn't come up with anything. There's a bridge in France called, it's an attraction called Normandy Luge, and it's an alpine coaster that's set at an old viaduct, and the viaduct is actually long gone, but the towers still remain, and it's kind of this neat vibe in the middle of a valley in the north of France, and that kind of colored my ideas about this park initially, but in the end it was something that I just couldn't really replicate without much scenery, and since we can't raise or lower landscaping because we don't actually own any of it, we're kind of just left with what we got to work with, but we'll make the best of it. So I'm going to go ahead and use the Kings Island drop zone colors and go ahead and recolor this thing with the purple, green, red, and yellow and call it a day there. Fits in very nicely inside the bobsled coaster and gives it a little bit more interaction there. So now as we expand to the other side of the map, wanted to do something a little bit more interesting with the pathway work. I'm not quite sure why. I guess just changing it up a little bit from what we did on the other side just to give it some variety. I did put another carousel in here, so you'll notice we have two. The intention was always that the other one was going to be replaced because I kind of liked the way that this kind of star-shaped path, I guess, worked well around the carousel. I felt like it was fairly interesting to do that. So we'll go ahead and put that one there. That will become our primary one, and then we'll replace the other one here a little bit later as we build. So trying to bring out some symmetry here in our path. Doesn't really offer us a lot of things to work with here, but we'll try and do something with it. So now we're going to hit our last coaster of this episode, and what I wanted to do on this one was build a compact Vekoma looping coaster. So this one is going to be based off of Blue Hawk at Six Flags Over Georgia, which was formerly Ninja, which is a spectacular layout. Really, really cool. Vekoma did lots of great custom layouts with their older ride systems. They had great layouts. Unfortunately, the ride quality didn't always match, so they weren't super well regarded. Ninja, when it became Blue Hawk, got new trains, and that definitely helped out on that one. But initially, what I was doing here was trying to make this thing fit into our typical scenario play scheme. But after talking with chat, we decided it might be best in this instance, because we don't really have scenery or landscaping or anything else to work with. We're going to do an audible here, and we're going to add in the new pieces that we have available. So we're going to be able to use medium loops and those larger corkscrews and the larger turns as well, the diving turns. So it's just going to give us something to work with here, and really I don't think it affects our overall play. It just gives us another tool to play around with. We're going to use this kind of sparingly, and I've already done it in another scenario here that's upcoming after this one, but in the end I think it works in this instance and doesn't really kind of detract from kind of our original classic playthrough. So this gives us an ability to have a nice smooth first drop, have a nice double inversion element there at the beginning, and I think works pretty well in general. So now it's just a matter of struggling to figure out how to build this thing. So you can see from how we started out, we did a bit of a reverse and started at the very, very end of the ride with those corkscrews, which are the last elements on the coaster, and worked backwards. Now I'm not doing a traditional exact recreation of the ride. We're just doing inspired by, which I always think is the better option in the game, simply because it doesn't force you into trying to match something exactly and doing something that just isn't going to work out quite right. It helps because then you can build something that is, like I said, inspired by. So you can say, okay, this one has the same inversions in the same general location, but all the things getting to and from those inversions might be a little bit different. So you can see, even still with inspired rather than a recreation, we're still having a little bit of trouble trying to get this whole thing to fit and work with the clearances and just, in general, kind of sit into the space. We've established more or less kind of the boundaries of our map or our ride anyway. So the turnaround there into the corkscrews is our upper bounds, and we know that the station is going to be right on the edge there after or before the lift hill, so we know that that's sort of the other bounds, and we have plenty of space to work with within that area, but now it's just a matter of trying to see exactly how it fits in. So we want to do this kind of big roll here, so this sea serpent-ish roll. It's a bit of a different thing in the real one, but something that's not exactly replicable in RCT, just because the elements don't quite work the way that the real one does. But we'll do something fairly similar with this, and it still looks kind of the same. Now we can build our turnaround element here with that Sidewinder. So the Sidewinder is what Arrow called the end of Vekoma, called the dive loop, because it's got that sort of half corkscrew, half loop. And now we have that whole section completed. So I'm trying to figure out here what this looks like in terms of getting to the finish. So now we're going to build backwards, and then we just got to connect the dots here. Our station is fairly high up. Unfortunately, just the nature of this coaster meant that it had to sit a little bit higher up than it might otherwise do, and the station sits high up because of that. It looks a little silly over top of the water, which I don't quite love, but at the same time, it's what we have to work with, so we're going to make the best of it. Now, the real one of these actually started on a pier. It started up in New Jersey at Dinosaur Beach, and then it was moved to over Georgia in, I want to say, 1992 or somewhere around there, and it has sat there ever since. So it does have a little bit of pedigree here to the seaside, I suppose. I don't know if this is meant to be the seaside or a river or what, but that's what I figured I'd use as a reference here. And one of the things that the original coaster had, when it was called Kamikaze, is it had a rapids ride running underneath of it. And it's kind of fun when you look at the pictures of Blue Hawk or Ninja sitting at Over Georgia. You can see the supports were customized to fit around that existing rapids ride. So now you have a ride that sits at Over Georgia with none of that underneath of it, and you have these just sort of random weird sports. So cool little nod to the previous location for the thing. So a bit of a secret thing to see. But we will wrap a log flume around this thing a little bit later, and we'll do that in the next episode. But first I want to finish this layout, and then we'll wrap it up for today. But I did go ahead and change the color. Sometimes when I'm stuck trying to figure out how this thing fills in the rest of the space and how we can complete it, I just need to stop, color it, maybe take a break, look at it a little bit differently, and then go back through. We spent quite a lot of time building this one and getting it to our satisfaction. And I will say, satisfaction's taken a little bit with a grain of salt. I don't really love how the ending worked out on this one, because what we're going to end up doing here is basically just an oval. We're going to go through those two corkscrews. We're going to have a right-hand turn and go straight underneath the lift hill before up and into the brakes. So it's basically just a big oval. Not necessarily an issue per se, but it's not quite my favorite ending. I would have liked to have done some kind of like a figure eight thing or something, but once you get into diagonals, the clearances become fairly difficult to work with, and it's just becomes a bit of a challenge. So what we'll do is something in the end like this, and that'll work just fine. So that's going to be it for us today on episode 1. We'll come back with episode 2 here and wrap up this one so we can move on to those more interesting scenarios next. But hope you enjoyed it as far as we could get. And until next time, we will talk to you a little later. Bye now.